Welcome back, everyone. I'm here with Nial, one of my colleagues, to talk about small liberal arts and sciences colleges. Hi, Nial.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we wanted to start with, I think most people know what large public universities are, or what public universities are, I should say, but we still gave a little definition. So I was hoping you could start by explaining what a liberal arts and sciences college is. And popularly, they're actually just called liberal arts colleges, but I always throw in the sciences because there's a lot of misunderstanding around that particular term. So maybe you could tell us a little more.
Absolutely. And let's start with that, right? It's liberal arts, but it's not anything political, right? The liberal there means that you have a lot of freedom of choice. Really,
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of the foundation of the term there. And in the arts, it's really arts and sciences and humanities and everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
That one might want to pursue in college that's available at liberal arts colleges. Now, they do come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, but the thing that does tie them together, as I was saying, is that flexibility within the curriculum. You tend not to be admitted to a major, you tend to be admitted
Mm-hmm.
to the college. And oftentimes you have a lot of room to be able to figure out, okay, what am I going to major in? Maybe double major and take classes that are drawing from a variety of intellectual areas in addition to your major. So that well-roundedness piece of it is really critical to understanding a liberal arts curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is how different that is from schools overseas. And I think this is relevant because we do have a good chunk of international people from other countries or people who have kind of recently immigrated here. They're sort of not used to this notion that you can just go in and like explore for a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you have any sense of like like if we could talk about like why that is considered to be a good idea in
Right.
the
And
US.
I was an international student
Mm-hmm.
from one of those places that didn't have this system, remotely nothing like the system until more recently, in fact. And yeah, so I had to sort of explain this to a lot of people. Um, but yeah, so here in the U.S., liberal arts colleges as institutions are as old as higher ed itself, because the first colleges in the U.S., dating back to the 1600s, in fact, were founded as liberal arts colleges. The first one being Harvard, and almost all, if not all of them, continue today to still be liberal arts colleges, including the first college, Harvard, right? So it has a long history tied in with how higher ed was envisioned in the US, that it really was about educating the whole person and the emphasis on the sort of intellectual life of a person in addition to the social life of a person, in addition to the spiritual life of a person, was all sort of wrapped into how this curriculum was designed. But in essence, it's founded on the idea that the breadth is as important as the depth, and that leads to people who are really great citizens, who are
Mm-hmm.
really great, adaptable people who have incredible toolkits that will follow them for life. And I'm sure we'll kind of get into that in more detail. But to your question, yes, it is a quite a different system from what is often found abroad in terms of the flexibility and choice that continues into your college years. But one thing that's really important to understand is that that depth does still exist. You still
Mm-hmm.
do have to major in at least one field, and it could be a hard science, or it could be a social studies course, or social studies field, or it could be really anything that you might imagine tends to exist at these sorts of colleges as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I may be getting ahead of my skis, but I always like to cite the list of baccalaureate origins of PhDs in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. And when you look at that list by number, unsurprisingly, UC Berkeley, Cornell, Michigan, schools like that are at the top. But when you look at it by institutional yield, in other words, by percentage of the student body, small colleges, small liberal arts and sciences colleges fall immediately on the heels of Caltech and Harvey Mudd are first, but then it's like Swarthmore, Reed, Carleton, Grinnell, places like that, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
pretty notable. And many of these schools don't even have engineering departments, although some
Right.
do.
Some do.
So I
Yeah.
always like to cite that as like, I think the sciences are pretty good, actually.
Totally. And we'll probably talk about during the course of our conversation the why behind some of that as well. Why is this a model that has been so successful and persistent through the
Hmm.
history of education in the US?
Yeah. I mean, do you want to talk about that now, or do you have
Let's do
something
it.
else you like? Why not? Yeah, because
Why not? Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I think that when I talk to people, sometimes they think if you go to a college like that, you're kind of a dilettante. You know what I mean? Like you're not focused on one thing, but actually, I found, and I was a student at a small liberal arts college, like that really I dove into my major in incredible depth, even though I was exposed more broadly initially. And there was such attention paid to the life of the mind. It was very much not a sort of pre-professional environment, which maybe it should have been more, right? Like,
Right.
but there was sort of no, it was really about like, what's the value of learning for its own sake?
Mhm.
What are your thoughts about how that, yeah, how that might lead to this sort of
Right.
high success rate?
And before we jump into that, it is important to note that these sorts of approaches, these sorts of colleges aren't necessarily for
Mm-hmm.
everyone. But I certainly argue often that they can be for most people,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they get misunderstood. So this is a great opportunity to dig into that, right? So when we talk about the breadth of skills, this toolkit of skills that you're developing, the toolkit of knowledge that you're developing as an undergraduate, the key piece there is broad applicability, is that adaptability in what is in reality an evolving world, what is in reality an evolving workplace, right? And young people know this really well, right? Even if you're in high school, things look really different now from what it did when you were in elementary school, and that has been going on forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of what keeps this sort of approach relevant is how folks that are trained, as you said, in the life of the mind, in being really good critical thinkers, being really great collaborators across difference, being able to make the most of diverse teams, and being able to analyze quantitative and qualitative data and make evidence-based arguments effectively and communicate really effectively, both in a written format as well as public speaking, being able to do all those things, right? And perhaps most importantly, to be a lifelong learner, right? Because you're trained in order to do that every single class you take fundamentally when you're an undergraduate, right? That translates to someone who could do any job, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could go to any grad school potentially as well. And that has really panned out from my sense of my experience. I went to, similarly to you, right, a small liberal arts college as well, and seeing how not only my life trajectory but also that of my peers who graduated with me have progressed. It's been really fascinating in that regard. So that piece of it, but let's not shortchange that depth element of it as well, right? And part of that is, yes, you pick your major, maybe two majors, right? And you still have to take a really big bite out of them. And we often use the term large research institutions versus small liberal arts colleges. The reality is these small liberal arts colleges, liberal arts institutions in general, tend to be undergraduate only institutions. And
Mm-hmm.
the faculty that teach at these colleges still have to get published, they still have to
Mm-hmm.
do research. And who do they turn to for support? They don't have graduate students. And as a result, undergraduates at these colleges get to do really high level independent work with the support of their faculty, experiential experiences, this range of different opportunities that you might have access to because you are a big fish in a small pond, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, and that your presence there and your active participation and engagement is critical to the success of the institution.
Mm-hmm.
So it is really cool to see those sorts of things happen. And, I'll say that from my own experience as an undergraduate, I'd love to share a little bit more if y'all would permit me,
Absolutely.
right? Because, and I'll say it even before I jump into it, right, that my experience wasn't necessarily atypical, but I think it gives a pretty good sense of what a liberal arts college experience could look like. Note now, today I have a graduate degree in education. I'm an educator, but I started as an undergraduate. I was an environmental studies major with a focus in policy. but I took classes in high-level economics and statistics and computer science, like modeling geographic information systems and all this really cool stuff. Literature, I wrote a thesis on Chinese environmental policy. Just such a cool range of different experiences. Academically, I took Chinese every single semester. I was in college, studied abroad there, was learning basically the Latin version of Chinese, like ancient Chinese at a university in central China. As part of my environmental studies major, I got to travel to Antarctica on a faculty and student climate change science expedition. My a cappella group, right? It's not just the academics. My a cappella group went to Japan together, right? I did an internship in Shanghai between my junior year and senior year. Spent a month there doing academic research. All of these experiences entirely funded by the college that I went to. And I could do all of those things because, in a sense, the culture was expecting that I do all of those things, and the opportunities were there to be taken advantage of. So, and that's, a lot of these things are off campus. It doesn't even mention all the different clubs and sports and activities and jobs that I had on campus, right? I was an RA and worked in the library, the admissions office. That's what led me to where I am today. But that sort of holistic, really in-depth experience with an opportunity to have hands-on experiences that get you out there into the world, whether in a professional setting or academic setting or otherwise, were absolutely instrumental in shaping my pathway through college, but also afterward. And all those skills that I talked about were not just developed in the classroom, they came around because of the close mentorship of faculty who I have incredible access to as well, right, as an undergraduate, but also in addition to that, the culture that really was motivating to be able to do those sorts of things.
I think that's really important because I think when you talk about culture, because that is a really big distinction, I think, between at least a large public university where the mission, as I was just talking about with Brittany Preston, our colleague, the mission is to serve everyone. And it's such an important mission. But small liberal arts and sciences colleges, they're trying to form a really intentional culture that is around the life of the mind. And that then I like this kind of what you were saying about it sort of creates an expectation as well as an opportunity, that you're going to take advantage of these resources and all the people around you are taking advantage of them. So that pushes you to do the same thing, I think.
Right. Absolutely. And what I don't want to give an impression of, right, that this is the ivory tower, that, these incredibly wealthy institutions are unattainable, these experiences are so rare, this and that, right? In reality, a lot of these colleges work really hard to ensure that their campus communities are socioeconomically diverse, are internationally, geographically diverse, are drawing domestically from all over the country, right? And so that piece of it does translate often to fairly generous merit-based scholarships, right? Does translate often to many of these colleges meeting 100% of demonstrated need if you're applying for need-based financial aid, right? So if that is a part of the perception, which I think does exist, Sally, I think perhaps you face this too in our conversations that we have with students often, right? To be like, oh, I'd never be able to afford this, so that's not even in the picture because X, Y, and Z. I'd say have an open mind toward looking at those elements of it too, because you might be surprised at what you find there as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I speak honestly, as I could not have attended Reed without a very significant financial aid package, and it included loans, but it was not excessive. And it depends on the institution, but for example, it is not uncommon that a low-income student, maybe one who qualifies for a Pell Grant, actually might receive more aid from a very expensive private college and might graduate with less debt than from, say, a public university, just because the funding might be more generous. I'm not trying to say that that's always the case, but it's worth it to look into it and to apply.
Right. And I wasn't some extraordinary academic student when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Middlebury College. I had basically 100% financial aid package. And again, would not have been able to do all these sorts of things if there wasn't continued support from the institution
Mm-hmm.
to ensure that everything was accessible and affordable to me. I wonder, Sally, knowing that we're a little crunched on time, whether we should also talk a little bit about outcomes, right? Because I think that can feel like a stressor, understandably and justifiably, for families and students who are thinking about these varieties of options. Sounds awesome. You can have these cool experiences. At the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day, what matters is this translates into
A
a
job.
job, right? It translates into
Mm-hmm.
sort of a sustainable life for the kid once they've graduated from college. And I'm here to hopefully allay some of those fears as well, right? That outcomes from these sorts of colleges are incredible, right? And part of why the smaller colleges, and as a result, there's a small alumni network often, right? But they the alumni networks tend to boast sort of the highest levels of engagement because these people had such great experiences that they want to sort of give back in that way and connect with young people who are at those colleges. And what we often talk about on our phone calls with families, right? That major does not necessarily equal career, right? As
Mm-hmm.
is the case with me and you and many people we
Mm-hmm.
know, right? And really what matters when you're applying for those first jobs is the story that you're able to tell
Mm-hmm.
about the toolkit that you've developed as an undergraduate of skills, of knowledge, of experiences. If you've been in that place where you can speak about, you can draw connections between disparate fields and experiences and classes that you've had, and to tie it together to be just the most impressive person who is a 21-year-old, 22-year-old applying for this job, that can open a ton of doors. And it
Mm-hmm.
does, really, because
I'm
you do have the
sorry.
ability to do that. Yeah.
I do have to cut you off. I really appreciate that you did that as the kind of summation, Nial. And
Right.
we'll talk
Yeah.
more about all of this. So come back to the podcast. So thanks to Nial and thanks to Robert Stewart and Brittany Preston. Definitely join us next week for our discussion on who should consider a gap year and why, whether you need to create a resume, and financial aid notifications for early applicants. And remember that you don't have to listen to our shows live. Every show is accessible 24/7 on the Voice America website. And you can also download every show for free on iTunes.